I never thought that a January night in Monterey would change me forever, that it would make me question everything I believed I knew about the universe and my place in it. There are moments in life where you cross an invisible line, and on the other side, nothing is ever the same, where the ordinary crumbles and you face something so incomprehensible that your mind struggles to find words, to find logic, to find any explanation that makes sense. What I lived through that freezing winter night wasn't just an encounter. It was a rupture in the fabric of everything I thought was real. And even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night wondering if it really happened, or if my mind created it all to cope with something my soul couldn't process. But the marks are still there. The memories are still vivid. And the being that I saved from the absolute cold left something in my life that I can never erase, something that visits me in dreams and whispers that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, and that some debts transcend the boundaries of worlds. My name is Miguel. I'm 42 years old now, and I work as a freight truck driver on the routes between Monterey and the northern border. It's honest work, solitary work, the kind that gives you too much time to think, too much time to get lost in the darkness of the highways while the radio plays norteño songs and your thoughts wander to places you'd rather not visit. I've always been a simple man, raised in a Catholic home where my grandmother taught me to pray the rosary every night, where I learned that there are forces beyond our understanding, but that God's protection is real if you keep faith in your heart. I never considered myself special, never thought the universe would choose me for anything beyond the ordinary life I was living. But that night in January 2019, everything changed, and I became part of something I still don't fully understand. It was one of those nights when the cold cuts through your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The heater in my truck had been failing for weeks, and I kept promising myself I'd get it fixed, but you know how it is. There's always something more urgent, always another bill to pay, always a reason to postpone what you know you should do. I was coming back from Laredo with an empty trailer, driving through that stretch of highway between Sabinas Hidalgo and Monterey, where there's nothing but darkness and the occasional gas station with its flickering lights like lonely beacons in an ocean of night. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, unusual even for January in this part of Mexico, and the weather forecast had warned about a cold front coming down from the north that would bring temperatures we hadn't seen in years. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I saw it. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a dog or a coyote that had wandered onto the highway. But as my headlights caught it, I realized it was something else entirely, something that made my heart skip and my hands tighten on the steering wheel. There in the middle of the road, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure, small and crouched, moving in a way that wasn't quite right, wasn't quite natural. My first instinct was to swerve around it, to keep driving and pretend I hadn't seen anything, because you hear stories about what happens on these highways at night, about cartels and hijackings and people who stop to help and never make it home. But something in me, something I can't explain even now, made me slow down, made me pull over to the shoulder, made me grab my flashlight and step out into that cutting cold. The figure was about 30 meters ahead, still in the road, and as I approached with my flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand, I could see it more clearly and my mind struggled to make sense of what my eyes were showing me. It was small, maybe a meter tall, with limbs that seemed too long and thin for its body, and it was shaking violently, convulsing really, like it was in the final stages of hypothermia. The skin, and I use that word loosely because it wasn't really skin as we know it, was a pale gray color that seemed almost luminescent in the beam of my flashlight, and when it turned its head toward me I saw eyes that were too large, too dark, like black pools that reflected my light back at me with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably conscious. I should have run. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as possible, to forget what I was seeing, to convince myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But those eyes held me frozen, and in them I saw something I recognized despite the absolute alienness of the being in front of me. I saw fear. I saw suffering. I saw a desperate plea for help that transcended language and species and everything that separates one conscious being from another. And in that moment, standing on that freezing highway in the middle of nowhere, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to help. I approached slowly, talking softly in Spanish, even though I had no idea if it could understand me, telling it that I wasn't going to hurt it, that I wanted to help, that everything would be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. The being didn't move away from me. It just kept shaking, kept looking at me with those impossibly large eyes. And when I got close enough, I could see that it was indeed dying from the cold, that whatever physiology it had was shutting down in temperatures that, for me, were just uncomfortable, but for it were absolutely lethal. Without thinking too much about what I was doing, I took off my heavy jacket and wrapped it around the being, and the moment the fabric touched its skin, I felt a sensation I can't adequately describe, like a vibration or a frequency that resonated through my hands and up my arms and into my chest where my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The being weighed almost nothing as I picked it up, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in cold silk, and I carried it back to my truck trying not to think about what I was doing, trying not to let the absolute impossibility of the situation overwhelm me. I placed it in the passenger seat and turned the failing heater up as high as it would go, and even though it barely produced any warmth, the being seemed to respond. Its shaking became less violent. Its breathing, if you could call it breathing, became more regular. I stood there in the cabin of my truck with this creature from God knows where, and all I could think was that my grandmother would have said this was a test, that God sometimes puts us in situations where we have to choose between fear and compassion, between running away and stepping forward into the unknown. I started driving again, heading toward Monterey, because I didn't know what else to do, and the being sat there wrapped in my jacket, its large eyes watching me with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. I tried talking to it, asking questions in Spanish that I knew it probably couldn't understand. Where are you from? What happened to you? How did you end up on this highway in the middle of winter? But it didn't respond with words. Instead, it made soft sounds that were almost musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. And somehow I understood that it was trying to communicate, trying to tell me something that my human brain couldn't quite grasp. Have you ever felt like you were living something that you can't explain? Something that changed you so deeply that you question your own memory of it? Leave your comment telling me what you felt. I want to know I'm not alone in this. Write in the comments, I felt something I can't explain. As we drove through the darkness, the being seemed to recover some strength. The shaking stopped almost completely and it shifted in the seat, adjusting my jacket around itself like it was discovering the concept of warmth for the first time. I kept glancing over at it, trying to memorize every detail because some part of me knew that this was a moment that would define the rest of my life, that I was living through something that most people never experience, something that would set me apart forever. The skin had a texture that reminded me of dolphin skin, smooth but not quite, and there were subtle patterns on it that seemed to shift and change in the dim light of the truck's cabin, like iridescent oil on water, like something alive and responding to stimuli I couldn't perceive. We were about 20 kilometers from Monterey when the being did something that almost made me drive off the road. It reached out one of its long, thin arms and placed what I can only describe as a hand on my forearm. And the moment it touched me, I felt a rush of images and emotions flood into my mind, not through my eyes or ears, but directly into my consciousness, like someone had opened a door in my head and poured in a cascade of information that I wasn't equipped to process. I saw stars I didn't recognize. I saw colors that don't exist in the human spectrum. I saw vast spaces that made our universe seem like a grain of sand on an infinite beach. And through it all, I felt the being's gratitude, its relief, its desperate need to survive that had driven it to trust me, a complete stranger from a world it didn't understand. The images stopped as suddenly as they started, leaving me gasping and sweating despite the cold, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. The being withdrew its hand and made those soft, musical sounds again, and somehow I knew it was apologizing, that it hadn't meant to overwhelm me, that it was just trying to say thank you in the only way it knew how. I wanted to pull over, to stop the truck and take a moment to catch my breath and make sense of what was happening. But something told me to keep driving, that we needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere away from the exposed highway where anyone could see us. I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Monterey, a simple place with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that doubled as my dining area. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and it was warm, and it was the only place I could think to take this being that I had rescued from the freezing highway. The streets were empty at that hour, the city sleeping under that unusual cold, and I managed to get the being into my apartment without anyone seeing us, wrapping it completely in my jacket and carrying it like you, would carry a sick child, quickly and purposefully, trying not to attract attention. Inside my apartment, I set the being down on my couch and turned on the space heater I kept in the corner, the one I only used on the coldest nights because the electricity bill was already high enough. The being unwrapped itself from my jacket, and I got my first clear look at it under the fluorescent lights of my living room. And what I saw confirmed that this was not of this earth, that I had brought something into my home that defied everything I thought I knew about biology and life and the universe itself. It was humanoid in the most basic sense, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso and a head, but the proportions were all wrong, the limbs too long and too thin, the head too large with that distinctive shape you see in movies and drawings but never expect to see in reality, and those eyes, those enormous black eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. I made coffee, not because I thought the being would drink it, but because I needed something to do with my hands, needed some normal action to anchor myself to reality as my mind spun with the impossibility of what was happening. The being watched me move around the kitchen, its head following my movements with an unsettling precision, and when I sat down in the chair across from the couch with my steaming mug, we just looked at each other for a long moment, 2 beings from different worlds trying to understand this bizarre situation we found ourselves in. I started talking again, telling it about my life because the silence was too heavy, too pregnant with questions I couldn't answer. I told it about my job driving trucks, about my grandmother who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8, about my ex-wife who left me 3 years ago because she said I was married to the highway more than I was married to her, about my daughter who I barely see because she lives in Guadalajara with her mother and visits maybe twice a year if I'm lucky. I told it about my fears and my loneliness, about the long nights on the road when I wonder if this is all there is, about the faith I inherited from my grandmother that sometimes feels like the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. The being listened, or at least it seemed to listen, those large eyes never leaving my face, and occasionally it would make those soft musical sounds that I was starting to think might be its form of speech. I wondered what it was thinking, if it understood anything I was saying, or if it was just responding to the tone of my voice, the way you would comfort a frightened animal with gentle words, even though the words themselves mean nothing. But there was an intelligence in those eyes that suggested understanding, that suggested this being was processing information in ways I couldn't comprehend, that perhaps communication was happening on levels I wasn't consciously aware of. As the night wore on and turned into early morning, the being seemed to relax more, the tension leaving its body as the warmth from the heater filled the room. It explored my apartment with a cautious curiosity, touching things with those long, delicate fingers, examining my books and my photos and my few possessions with an interest that seemed almost childlike. When it found the small statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe that my grandmother had given me, it held it for a long time, turning it over in its hands, and I wondered what it made of our human need for symbols and faith, if its kind had anything similar or if they had evolved beyond such things. I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke with a start to find the sun rising outside my window and the being sitting on the floor in front of the heater, its body positioned to catch as much warmth as possible. The morning light gave its skin a different quality, less gray and more opalescent, shifting between colors as it moved, and I noticed details I hadn't seen in the darkness. What looked like very fine lines or maybe circuits running under the skin, pulsing with a faint light that reminded me of bioluminescent creatures I'd seen in documentaries about the deep ocean. I made breakfast, eggs and beans and tortillas, and set a plate on the coffee table, not really expecting the being to eat, but feeling like I should offer. To my surprise, it approached the food and examined it carefully, then picked up a piece of tortilla and held it close to where I assumed its nose would be if it had one in the conventional sense. It didn't eat the tortilla, but it seemed to analyze it somehow, and then it set it down gently and made a sound that I interpreted as a polite refusal. I ate my breakfast while the being watched, and I tried to figure out what I was going to do because I couldn't keep it hidden in my apartment forever, and I had no idea who I could turn to for help without ending up in a psychiatric ward or worse. The being solved that problem for me in a way I didn't expect. After I finished eating, it approached me and once again placed its hand on my arm, and this time I was prepared for the rush of images, or at least I thought I was. What I saw was a ship, or what I interpreted as a ship, though it looked nothing like any aircraft or spacecraft I'd ever seen, more like a living thing than a machine, pulsing with light and suspended in the air above a barren landscape that I assumed was somewhere on Earth, though I couldn't recognize the location. The being showed me that it had been separated from this ship, that some kind of malfunction or accident had left it stranded on the highway where I found it, and that the ship was looking for it, waiting for it, but couldn't risk coming too close to populated areas where it might be seen. The images shifted and I saw a location, a place I recognized immediately because I'd driven past it hundreds of times, an old abandoned ranch about 40 kilometers north of the city. Nothing there but collapsed buildings and empty fields that nobody had used in decades. The being wanted me to take it there, wanted me to help it get to this place where it could be reunited with its ship, with its kind, with whatever waited for it beyond this world. And as the images faded and I came back to myself, breathing hard and gripping the arm of my chair, I knew I was going to do it. Knew I had no choice, really, because how could I help this being survive the cold only to abandon it when it needed one more thing from me? But first I had to get through the day. Had to call my dispatcher and tell him I was too sick to drive. Had to figure out how to keep the being hidden and comfortable until nightfall when I could risk driving it to the rendezvous point without being seen. The being seemed to understand that we had to wait. It settled back onto the couch and stayed very still. And I went about my day as normally as I could, which wasn't very normal at all considering I had an extraterrestrial being in my living room. I spent the day alternating between watching the being and watching the news on my phone, half expecting to see reports of UFO sightings or missing persons or something that would indicate this was part of a larger event. But there was nothing. Just the usual stories about politics and crime and the weather. The cold front that had everyone complaining, but that had probably saved the being's life by forcing me to take that particular route at that particular time. Coincidence or something more? I didn't know. My grandmother would have said there are no coincidences, that God has a plan even when we can't see it. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was supposed to find this being. Maybe we were supposed to help each other in ways I still don't fully understand. The being didn't need to eat or drink as far as I could tell, but it did seem to need warmth and rest, and it spent most of the day in a state that looked like sleep, though its eyes never fully closed, just became dim like someone had turned down the lights behind them. I tried to read, tried to watch television, tried to do anything to make the time pass faster, but my mind kept returning to what would happen that night, to the moment when I would have to say goodbye to this being that had already changed me in profound ways, that had shown me the universe is so much bigger and stranger than I ever imagined. As evening approached and the sun began to set, the being became more active, more alert, and I could sense its anticipation, its eagerness to leave this world that must have been as alien to it as its world would be to me. I wrapped it again in my jacket, and we went down to my truck, the being moving quickly now despite its unusual gait, and I drove north through the darkening evening toward the abandoned ranch, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement and sadness that this extraordinary encounter was coming to an end. The ranch was exactly as I remembered it, a collection of crumbling buildings surrounded by overgrown fields, accessible by a dirt road that my truck handled easily despite the ruts and potholes. I drove as far back as I could, away from the highway, away from any possibility of being seen, and when I turned off my headlights, the darkness was absolute except for the stars overhead, more stars than you usually see because we were far from the city lights, far from anything human. The being stepped out of the truck and stood very still, its head tilted back as if it was listening to something I couldn't hear, and then it made a sound different from any it had made before, a long rising note that seemed to vibrate in my chest and make the air around us shimmer. We waited there in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and then I saw it, a light in the sky that wasn't a star or a plane or anything conventional, a light that moved with an intelligence and purpose that made my mouth go dry and my legs feel weak. The ship descended silently, and I use the word ship, though it didn't look like any ship I'd ever imagined, more like a living organism made of light and something else, something that hurt to look at directly because it seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. It hovered above the field, maybe 20 meters off the ground, and a beam of light extended down to where we stood, and in that light I could see shapes, moving, other beings like the one I had rescued, coming to retrieve their lost member. The being I had helped turned to me one last time and placed both its hands on either side of my head, and what happened next I can barely put into words. It was like every emotion I'd ever felt was amplified and returned to me, every moment of loneliness and fear and love and hope concentrated into a single instant that seemed to last forever. And through it all I felt the being's gratitude, not just gratitude, but something deeper, a connection that transcended species and worlds and everything that should have separated us. I saw myself through its eyes, saw how strange and beautiful and terrifying I must have appeared to it, saw the kindness in my actions that I had never recognized in myself, and I understood that this encounter had changed us both, that we had given each other something precious in that exchange. Then the being released me and stepped into the beam of light, and I watched as it rose upward toward the ship, toward home, toward a future I could never be part of. The ship remained for a moment longer, hovering there in the night sky, and I felt like it was looking at me, acknowledging me, thanking me in its own incomprehensible way. And then it was gone, shooting upward so fast that it left after images in my vision, disappearing into the stars like it had never been there at all. I stood in that field for a long time after the ship left, looking up at the sky and trying to process what had happened, trying to hold on to the memory because I knew that this was something I could never share, something that most people would never believe, something that would sound like the ravings of a madman if I tried to explain it. Eventually the cold drove me back to my truck and I drove home through the empty night, and when I got to my apartment it was like nothing had happened. My jacket was on the couch where the being had left it. The space heater was still running. My breakfast dishes were still in the sink. Everything normal except that I was fundamentally changed, marked by something I could never forget. The days after that encounter were strange. I went back to work and drove my routes, and did everything I was supposed to do. But nothing felt the same. It was like I was watching my life from the outside, going through the motions, but not really present. People noticed the change in me. My dispatcher asked if I was okay. A waitress at my usual truck stop told me I looked different somehow. My daughter called and said I sounded weird on the phone, but I couldn't explain it to them. Couldn't tell them that I had touched something beyond this world, and it had touched me back and left me forever altered. I started having dreams, vivid dreams where I was floating in vast spaces between stars, where I could see the universe the way the being had shown me, infinite and beautiful and terrifying in its immensity. Sometimes in these dreams, I would see the being again, healthy and whole, and it would communicate with me in that wordless way, sharing images and emotions that I couldn't quite hold on to when I woke up, but that left me with a sense of peace and connection that I'd never felt before. My grandmother used to say that dreams are messages from God, and maybe she was right. Maybe these dreams were a gift from the being or from whatever force had brought us together. A reminder that I had done something good, something that mattered in ways I might never fully understand. But there were darker moments too, moments when the enormity of what I knew weighed on me like a physical burden. We are not alone. We have never been alone, and that knowledge changed everything about how I saw the world and my place in it. All the things that used to matter, all the petty concerns and daily worries seemed insignificant compared to the vastness of what was out there, and I struggled with a sense of isolation that came from knowing something profound that I could never share, from being set apart by an experience that had no place in the ordinary world I had to live in. I thought about going public, about telling my story to the media or posting it online or doing something to let people know what I had experienced. But every time I considered it, I remembered the being's vulnerability, the trust it had placed in me, and I couldn't risk drawing attention that might put it or others like it in danger. Because if I had found it that night, if I had been able to help it, then surely there were others out there, other beings visiting this world for reasons I couldn't fathom, and the last thing they needed was humanity's attention, humanity's fear, humanity's tendency to destroy what it doesn't understand. So I kept silent, and the silence became its own kind of burden, a secret that isolated me even from the people I loved. My daughter visited a few months after the encounter, and I wanted so badly to tell her, to share with her this incredible thing that had happened to her father. But when I looked at her, I saw her mother's skepticism, her modern education that had taught her to dismiss anything that couldn't be measured or proven, and I knew she wouldn't believe me, that trying to tell her would only create distance between us when we already had so little connection left. Instead, I showed her kindness in small ways. I listened more carefully when she talked. I tried to be more present during her visit, instead of letting my mind wander to the highway and the jobs waiting for me. And I think she noticed. She told me I seemed calmer somehow, less restless. And she hugged me longer than usual when she left, and in that moment I felt the being's influence in my life, the way it had taught me without words about the importance of connection, about the precious value of every encounter between conscious beings, about the responsibility we have to help each other across whatever our divides separate us. The marks it left weren't just emotional or psychological. There were physical changes too, subtle things that I noticed over the months following the encounter. My hands, the hands that had touched the being and felt that strange vibration, sometimes tingled late at night. Sensation like very low electric current running through my fingers, and when this happened I would find myself more aware of things around me, more sensitive to the moods of people I met, more attuned to the subtle energies that most people never notice. It wasn't anything dramatic. I didn't develop superpowers or psychic abilities or anything like that. But it was like a door had been opened in my perception that I couldn't close again, like I had been given a small gift of awareness that came from my contact with something beyond human understanding. I started seeing patterns I'd never noticed before, coincidences that seemed too meaningful to be random. Moments when the universe appeared to be communicating in a language I was just beginning to learn. I would think of someone and they would call. I would dream of a place and drive past it the next day. I would feel drawn to change my route for no apparent reason, only to avoid an accident that happened right where I would have been. My grandmother would have said I was developing my spiritual sight, that God was opening my eyes to the deeper reality beneath the surface of things. And maybe she was right, or maybe the being had changed something in me on a fundamental level, rewired my brain in some subtle way that science couldn't measure but that I felt every day. There were times when I doubted my own memory, when the rational part of my mind tried to convince me that it had all been a hallucination, a stress-induced break from reality brought on by too many lonely nights on the highway, too much time alone with my thoughts. But then I would feel that tingling in my hands, or I would have one of those impossibly vivid dreams, or I would see something in the sky that moved in ways that defied physics, and I would know with absolute certainty that it had been real, that I had truly helped a being from another world, that I had been changed by an encounter that most of humanity would never experience. I started paying more attention to the news about UAPs and unexplained phenomena, reading accounts from other people who claimed to have had encounters, and I was struck by the similarities in their stories, the descriptions of beings with large eyes and gray skin, the ships that defied conventional physics, the sense of communication that happened beyond language, the lasting changes in perception and awareness. Some of these people were clearly making things up, seeking attention or trying to profit from their claims. But others I believed because I heard in their words the same confusion and awe and isolation that I felt. The same burden of knowing something profound that the world wasn't ready to accept. I wondered sometimes if the being I helped was okay, if it had made it home safely, if it ever thought about that strange night when it had been stranded on a freezing highway and rescued by a human truck driver who had acted on impulse and compassion rather than fear. I like to imagine it was somewhere out there among the stars, living its life, perhaps telling its own people about the bizarre encounter with a primitive being from a cold world who had wrapped it in his jacket and carried it to safety, who had shown it that kindness exists even across the vast divides of evolution and origin. My life continued. The seasons changed. Winter gave way to spring and summer and fall and another winter, and I kept driving my routes, kept hauling freight across the northern states of Mexico, kept watching the highways at night and wondering if I would ever have another encounter, if lightning could strike twice in one lifetime. Part of me hoped it would, hoped I would see that small figure on the road again and have another chance to help, another chance to connect with something beyond this world. But another part of me knew that what had happened was singular and precious precisely because it would never be repeated, that I had been given a gift that I should cherish rather than constantly seeking more. I became more conscious of the cold, more aware of how deadly it could be, and on freezing nights when I was driving I would scan the road, more carefully, alert for anything unusual, anyone or anything that might be in danger. I started carrying extra blankets in my truck, a better emergency kit, a more reliable heater. Not because I expected to find another stranded alien, but because the encounter had taught me about vulnerability and the importance of being prepared to help whoever or whatever might need it. I helped more people after that, stopped for stranded motorists I would have driven past before, gave rides to hitchhikers despite the risks, bought meals for the homeless guys I saw at truck stops, and each time I helped someone, I felt like I was honoring the being, honoring that moment when I had overcome my fear and chosen compassion. My faith changed too, became less about the specific doctrines my grandmother had taught me and more about a sense of wonder at the mystery of existence. I still prayed, still crossed myself when I passed a church, still wore the medal of San Cristobal that she had given me for protection on the road. But now, when I prayed, I found myself including the being and its kind, asking God or the universe or whatever force governed reality to watch over them the way I hoped they were watching over us, to protect them in their travels through the cold darkness of space, the way I had protected one of them from the cold darkness of that January night. People ask me sometimes if I believe in aliens, usually in the casual way people discuss such things over beers or while waiting for cargo to load, and I always say yes, but I never tell them why, never share the real reason for my certainty. I let them think I'm just another person who finds the universe too big for us to be alone, who thinks the odds favor other life out there somewhere, and they nod and agree, and we move on to other topics, and the secret stays locked inside me where it has lived for years now, growing heavier and lighter at the same time, a burden and a blessing, a source of isolation and connection, the defining experience of my life that I can never fully share. I think about mortality more, now about what happens when we die and where we go, and whether consciousness continues in some form beyond the death of the body. The being showed me dimensions and possibilities I hadn't imagined, and it made me wonder if the heaven my grandmother believed in might be just one of countless other realms, if the souls of the dead might travel through those vast spaces I saw in my visions, if death is not an ending but a transition into something stranger and more wonderful than religious texts can capture. It's a comforting thought when the loneliness gets too heavy, when I'm driving through the night and feeling the weight of all the things I can't say to anyone, the idea that maybe this life is just one chapter in a much longer story, that maybe someday I'll understand why this happened to me, what it all meant, where it fits into the larger pattern of existence. My daughter got married last year, a small ceremony in Guadalajara that I almost missed because I was on a long haul to Texas, but I rearranged my schedule and made it there. And when I saw her in her white dress, happy and hopeful, and starting a new chapter of her life, I felt a rush of emotion that brought me to tears. She thought I was crying because my little girl was all grown up, and that was part of it. But I was also crying because I realized I had learned something important from the being, that every moment of connection is precious, that we have to cherish the people we love while we have them, because the universe is vast and cold, and most of it is empty space. But here, in this tiny corner of reality, we have each other, and that's a kind of miracle all on its own. I gave her my grandmother's rosary as a wedding gift, the one my grandmother had used every night before bed, the beads worn, smooth by decades of prayers. And when my daughter held it in her hands and looked at me with tears in her own eyes, I felt multiple generations connecting through that simple object, felt the past and present and future converging. And I understood that this is how we survive as a species, not through grand technological achievements or conquests of space, but through these small acts of love and continuity, these passing down of objects and stories and values from one generation to the next. The being had shown me the vastness of the cosmos, but my daughter showed me the importance of what we have right here, right now, the people we love and the lives we build, and the meaning we create in the face of an indifferent universe. I still drive the northern routes, still pass that stretch of highway where I found the being, and every time I do, I slow down a little, my eyes scanning the darkness, my heart hoping and not hoping for another impossible encounter. The rational part of me knows it won't happen again, that the being's ship would never risk another accident, that they've learned to avoid the cold fronts and the dangers of this world. But the part of me that was changed by that encounter keeps looking, keeps hoping, keeps wondering what other mysteries might be waiting in the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my truck and the highway stretches endlessly before me, I talk to the being as if it could hear me. I tell it about my day, about my daughter, about the world it briefly visited. And I imagine it listening somewhere out there among the stars, remembering the strange human who helped it, carrying its own version of our story through whatever alien life it leads. And in those moments I don't feel alone. I feel connected to something larger than myself, part of a web of consciousness that spans worlds and species and evolutionary paths, bound together by the simple truth that kindness matters, that helping matters, that every act of compassion ripples outward in ways we can never fully measure or understand. The encounter taught me that we are not the center of creation, that humanity is just one small note in a symphony so vast and complex we can barely perceive its scope. But it also taught me that we matter, that our choices matter, that the decision I made to stop on that freezing highway and help a dying being was significant in ways that transcended the moment itself. I saved a life that night. I helped something return to where it belonged. And in doing so, I became part of something larger than my small human existence, part of a story that connects this world to others we've never seen, part of a possibility that maybe, just maybe, we are capable of more than we think we are. I am 42 years old. I drive trucks for a living. I have a daughter I don't see often enough. I carry secrets that isolate me from the people around me. And I was changed forever by a January night when I chose to help instead of looking away. The cold front passed, the seasons cycled through their ancient rhythms, life continued in its ordinary way, but I carry the memory of those large, dark eyes looking at me with desperate need. I carry the sensation of that first touch and the rush of cosmic awareness it brought. I carry the image of the ship ascending into the stars, and these memories have become part of who I am, woven into the fabric of my identity in ways I can never undo. Do I regret stopping that night? Do I wish I had driven past and kept my comfortable ignorance intact? Sometimes when the weight of knowing gets too heavy, when I feel most alone with this secret, I wonder what my life would be like if I had made a different choice. But then I remember the being's gratitude, the connection we shared across every divide that should have separated us. And I know I would do it again, would always do it again, because helping was the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences for my own peace of mind. We are not alone in this universe. We share it with intelligences beyond our current understanding, with beings who travel between stars on missions we cannot fathom, and sometimes, on rare and precious occasions, our paths cross, and we have the opportunity to show what humanity is capable of at its best. I was given that opportunity and I took it, and it changed me in ways I'm still discovering, ways I will probably spend the rest of my life trying to understand. Now it's your turn to share. Have you ever experienced something that you couldn't explain? Something that changed how you see the world? Have you ever felt a connection to something beyond the ordinary boundaries of life? Maybe you've seen something in the sky that moved in impossible ways. Or maybe you've felt a presence you couldn't identify. Or maybe you've just had that nagging feeling that there's more to reality than what we're taught to believe. Whatever your experience, I want to hear about it. Leave your comment. Tell me your story. Share what you felt, because these experiences connect us. They remind us that we're all navigating this strange existence together, trying to make sense of mysteries that might never be fully explained. If you've made it this far in my story, if something in it resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to hear more stories like mine, and know that you're not alone in wondering about the bigger questions, about what else is out there, about what it all means. I don't know if I'll ever have another encounter, if the being will ever return, or if others like it will cross my path, but I remain open to the possibility. I keep my eyes on the darkness. I stay ready to help if help is needed. That's what the encounter taught me above all else, that we have a responsibility to each other and to any other conscious beings we might meet, a responsibility to act with kindness and courage, even when we're afraid, even when we don't understand, even when helping might cost us our comfortable certainties about how the world works. The being I saved from the absolute cold gave me something in return, not intentionally perhaps, but as a natural consequence of our brief connection. It gave me a glimpse of the infinite, a sense of the vast tapestry of existence that extends far beyond this small blue planet we call home. And that gift has sustained me through the lonely nights and the doubtful days, has reminded me that there is always more to discover, always deeper mysteries to contemplate, always The possibility that the next mile of highway might bring another encounter with the impossible, another chance to choose compassion over fear, another opportunity to be changed by the strange and beautiful universe we inhabit.